For my senior project, I volunteered at Clemency Medical Center. 3 times a week, I would leave school early, drive to the hospital, and work in their urban garden. I was pretty underwhelmed at first. When I applied, I assumed that I'd be working directly with the patients, but that wasn't the case. Despite this, I'd be working closely with the hospital, and it wasn't as bad as I initially thought. A few months ago, the hospital hired an environmentalist named Homer to rejuvenate their old garden, and he tilled the land and planted organic fruits and vegetables. Through Homer's hard work, the garden prospered, and the crops grew in half the time, even without artificial fertilizers or pesticides. The primary goal was to grow fresher, healthier food to supplement the patients' diets. By all intents and purposes, this urban garden was a local success story. But it wasn't always such. Before the hospital hired Homer, the land had been severely neglected. It had been such a terrible eyesore that the hospital built an iron fence around its perimeter. The iron fence is still there. On my first day, I showed up with scribbled directions and a volunteer name tag. Following my chicken scratch, I entered through a pair of heavy double doors and skirted around nurses and medical equipment. When I reached the end of the corridor, I noticed a woman interviewing a man wearing a green apron. I respectfully stood to the side and waited until the woman closed her notebook and left. I watched her go and smiled lightly when the man approached me. My first impression of Homer was rather innocent. He reminded me of a friendly giant with his thick beard and muscle-bound arms and his cheerful smile. He didn't strike me as a gardener, but he did have a very kind personality. Homer was very gentle, very caring. I'd be weeding some of the vegetables, and I'd glance over to see him pushing wooden stakes into the soil. The cheap stakes were for the plants, providing the larger ones with much-needed support. The stakes quickly spread throughout the garden, and Homer would study each individual plant to determine if they needed a helping hand. It was rather sweet. He'd become so absorbed into his work too, and I could tell that he put his heart and soul into it. The best part was when the patients visited with their caregivers. They'd smile and thank Homer for growing them delicious food. I remember this one elderly lady who described how she watched the garden from her windowsill. For days she had pleaded to see it for herself, especially after sampling some of the berries in her morning oatmeal. When Homer heard that, he picked a handful of strawberries for her, and the lady nearly burst into tears at his kind gesture. The patients that often visited were the ones with extended stays at Clemency Medical Center, all with varying health conditions. Just like Homer, I wanted to make them smile. I wanted to improve their stay. I sometimes received praise for assisting Homer, and the compliments made everything worthwhile considering there were only a few volunteers. Usually, only 2 people tending to the garden at a time, with Homer constantly hovering. At times, I wondered about Homer's personal life. While I'd make my rounds watering the plants, I'd try to picture Homer's house, and I'd imagine a beautiful garden surrounding it. It would be exceptional and maintained year-round. Even with his adoration for life, I pictured Homer as a single man who lived in solitude. Occasionally he'd ask me about my family and friends, and I'd happily tell him about my life. I'd try asking him the same questions, but they didn't get very far. He was probably just socially awkward, or he probably didn't enjoy talking about himself. There was something respectable in that. Homer had his off days, though. By my second month, I was arriving early on the job and going straight to work. One afternoon, I was tilling the soil at the edge of some tomato plants. Earlier in the week, Homer had mentioned purchasing seeds, so I decided to do the job for him. I dragged the tool gently through the soil until I felt a snag. I tilted my head to the side and began digging lightly. It could be a network of roots, and I had to be careful not to harm any of them. I poked the area and felt something hard. Well, there was something there, all right. When Homer appeared through the back door, I stood and brushed the dirt off my hands. He began questioning me, and I don't know why it made me feel so awkward. I realized from the orientation of the garden that it was quite organized. This was Homer's turf, and I had no intention of messing it up. As soon as I explained myself, he brushed it off. Homer had this very cheery, go-getter attitude. He accepted mistakes and insisted we learn from them. He suggested leaving that section of the garden to himself. He mentioned the topsoil being very thin, coupled with a thick layer of bedrock beneath it. I flashed him an understanding smile and scurried off to water the green beans instead. It had rained the night before, but I just wanted to stay out of his hair. For the most part, everything went smoothly from there. I adapted and began noticing Homer was rather finicky with some of the sections in the garden. I left those particular spots to him. He was the master gardener after all. However, at the end of my internship, there was some tension. Another female volunteer purchased 24 flowers in seed packets to plant in a barren section of the garden. When the flowers were fully grown, she suggested giving them to the patients or selling them in the gift shop. I thought that it was a brilliant idea, so when I arrived that day, I constantly crossed over to help. I grabbed a shovel and began digging holes. We planted 2 containers worth of flowers before she had to leave for the day. I waved to her and returned to planting. I began digging a fresh hole and, almost instantly, I hit something solid. I huffed and forced the shovel down until I heard an audible crunch. I paused and poked around in the hole. What the hell made that sound? There was no way that was a gigantic root. Homer's looming shadow stopped me from investigating further. I held my breath and slowly lowered the shovel. His tone was quivering. I assumed the volunteer had told Homer about the flowers, but she hadn't. Maybe she meant for it to be a surprise, but Homer didn't appear surprised at all. He just seemed off. I stood slowly and avoided eye contact with him. I apologized profusely. If anything, I respected Homer's unspoken rules, and would never have intentionally broken them. I excused myself, left an apologetic note at the front desk, and never returned. He wasn't mad about the flowers. He could have cared less about the flowers. It was a hole. For a while I was nervous. Ridiculously nervous. I wrote my research paper, I did my presentation. Then I graduated, and the senior project was far behind me. It was in the middle of the summer when I received the gift. The doorbell rang, and a basket of produce was left on my doorstep. A note was tucked between 2 red apples. It was written on Clemency Medical Center's stationery. Thank you for being a part of our green family. We hope you'll visit us sometime soon. Best wishes. The note was generic and not signed by anyone. I knew it was from Homer, though. I didn't hesitate. I went straight to the garbage can and dropped the gift inside. I wanted no part of it. I didn't want to be a part of their green family. Not now, not ever. I didn't leave Clemency because I was embarrassed. I was afraid of what Homer might do. This gift, it was a warning. The garden, it made sense now. I understood Homer's strange behavior. I understood why the plants grew without fertilizer. It wasn't a garden at all. It was a shallow mass grave